You are listening to My HR Buzz, brought to you by My HR Concierge. Hosted by Chris Cooley, we'll bring you various topics and guests to shed light on the often confusing world of HR and also employee screening. We'll be putting the human in human resources.
I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I think we've got a really good topic. I think we've got a topic that'll be that's very current, and it'll be a great listen. And today we're very fortunate. We have Craig Orgeron with the Mississippi. He's the executive director and state chief information officer for the state of Mississippi, and knows a great deal about artificial intelligence. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about that. Maybe some updates on where it is today, maybe some different things about how it affects small businesses. And I really appreciate you joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's the kind of topic that when you talk about it, Chris, it's different every day. So it can certainly be fun in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such an emphasis right now, because I know with the state, we've done several different partnerships to build workforce in the AI. To really build out our workforce abilities, to obviously draw partners, enterprise partners into the state. And I know we recently partnered with NVIDIA on that.
We did. So I think there's a really big emphasis in general to your comment about workforce and workforce development, and I know the governor's been really focused on that part of it, right? So we had great announcements of data centers coming to Madison County with AWS, data centers coming over to Lauderdale County and Meridian with a company called Compass. But the two big components, you mentioned in NVIDIA, which the governor announced last week. So very, very workforce and sort of skills-oriented programming. What these companies have, if you go and look at the press release for NVIDIA, they actually have teaching kits, right? So these companies are just really great partners, because what these teaching kits allow faculty to do is really just literally, you can ingest this content right into a learning management system, right? And sort of which is fabulous, right? That these resources come like that. So both the announcement that you mentioned with NVIDIA and also the AI Accelerator program, which was sort of connected to AWS, very, very similar. So the governor just a few weeks back announced, I think it was 9 awards to schools across the state with a very similar emphasis, right? It's really about training. It's really about giving students that are coming up and through our colleges and universities skills, right? So sometimes it could be a pending sort of a technical degree with a degree with additional skills, but maybe you're a business major, or maybe you're a history major, right? What we're kind of acknowledging is that AI is going to have pretty phenomenal impact, right, across many different sectors. So regardless of the kind of degree that a student may be coming out with, being at least conversant. In the spring, Millsaps College hosted a lecture, and the University of Florida, I think, came down and sort of talked about some of the stuff they're doing. So they're partnered with NVIDIA, but they actually have an undergraduate certificate in AI, right? So in other words, any undergraduate has basic knowledge, basic skills, kind of understands the semantics. So, maybe you're getting out and getting into different sectors. Maybe you're going into energy, maybe you're going into transportation or healthcare. And regardless of that skill set, you have some of the basics to do that. So you're right in pointing it out. I think it's a tremendously exciting time. And I think to really be candid, I think the governor's really led not just on the economic development side of it, but really the acknowledgement of, raising Mississippi up with a skilled workforce, right? So we can attract businesses here, and we have, graduates who can do that work.
Yeah, and I look at it as, it's kind of the new internet of our time, right? We're going from, not that I didn't love walking through Blockbuster and spending an hour trying to figure out
Me,
just the right movie,
me too.
to where then we could stream online with the internet. This is kind of that next
Yes.
iteration, and I think it is important that that business owners, they don't have to know how to program it, but I think that they do have to understand the best uses for it,
Mhm.
where it excels, where maybe it doesn't excel.
Agreed.
And so I think that's very important in these learning packets. And where do you, from a small business perspective, where do you see that going? Because we kind of have, one to Elon, right?
Mhm.
We've got sales leads and those things, and then we have this stuff that Elon's doing where he's got, armies of robots. So, where do you see that going here in the near future?
So I think you're really spot on. I think thinking about it from a use case perspective is really, really important, right? So some of the work that we're doing in the state is getting folks to think about use cases, right? And you get into use cases, typically we use sort of this phrase of what are your pain points? Like whatever your business is, what are your pain points? We then sort of really acknowledge that you need to really be thinking from a risk perspective as well, right? And the way we typically frame it is you really want something, and you spoke to this, Chris, you want sort of minimal risk in the beginning, but more maximum payoff. So, like, what are some of those trade-offs where you can develop a use case that helps you utilize this technology? The risks are nominal, right? From a hallucination, from a data privacy, depending on the kind of business that you're in, any sort of ethical concerns, but the payoff is bigger. And I think if you can find, if you think about a matrix, right, of value and risk, and kind of do some work there with your team, that really tends to pay a lot of dividends. What are your choke points? What are the points that you have to contemplate? And I think that's a really fabulous way to start. One thing to acknowledge when you start, and I was just talking about this earlier this morning, is it's really all about data, right? I mean, especially there's this conversation now about open source and not, even in the AI space, right? Do I go get a model, like a model from Meta, one of the Llama models, and do I bring it in-house and train it on my data? And what skills do I need to do that? Versus do I sort of consume something that's already there?
Right.
That debate is happening, and I kind of find that debate really interesting from a skill sets perspective as well. But I do think, to be candid, you have to acknowledge that underneath the hood here, and I guess this statement would apply to a lot of things, of it's really about the data, right? That this technology is on top of it, but you've really got to be thoughtful about, is your data well architected? Is it well curated? Because whatever analysis you do or whatever model you run, it's going to really be about the data that's underneath it. So we sort of like to talk about the point that you made about, the impact that something like this will have on the future, like the internet did, but then also acknowledge, there's a lot of privacy, ethical, regulatory things to talk about. But underneath all of that, you really got to have good data to really build a use case, for your customers that's valuable.
Yeah. Yeah. And to your point, the security aspect,
Oh gosh.
because
Yeah.
what we know is ChatGPT and all the others can do wonderful things. They can work with Excel spreadsheets. They can do all these different things. But generally, if you're going to use ChatGPT, you've signed an agreement.
Yeah.
And you really need to understand what's in that agreement, because you may have employers that are putting payroll data and putting them in ChatGPT because they want it to dissect it for them in some
Yes.
way. And so that's one thing, really understanding and I think it's a great point, really understanding who now has access to that data
Yes.
and what they can do with it.
Yes, I agree totally. And some of these models that a lot of us may be consuming at scale is trained on just an incredible amount of data, right? So much so that if you can believe this, the synthetic data business is beginning to grow, right? Which is a business where companies actually create synthetic data to help train these models, right? Because these models, train on such large amounts of data. So I think that's another thing to think about, right? So there may be a small business in a particular sector. So there may be your data, but there may be auxiliary data sets, right, inside your sector that you could consume to help you make those decisions. So, some of these models that, in mid 2025 that we're using, ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude by Anthropic, if you've played with any of these, they're trained on just an unbelievable amount of data, right, to render. But the results are, I would argue, generalized, right? They're not trained on very specific kind of data. So I do think, in a small business perspective, you know, um, maybe competing at scale, right? I mean, so there's sort of an accelerant that, maybe it's your ability to support your customers. We talked about the HR component. Maybe I've heard some really interesting use cases on marketing, writing material for marketing and those kind of things. So there could be some use cases that are, pivots on differentiation. Maybe this is the way you differentiate from potential competitors. Or I sort of say, I either say scale your business or accelerate,
Yeah.
and I do think the tool, at least in its early stages, has the ability to do that. I heard a really great story. There's a company called eRepublic. It's a company that does public sector kind of things, think tank stuff, and that one of the use cases was their marketing, right? And that their marketing team was really nervous. It was sort of are these tools going to displace me? And the story was just so cool because what it sort of eventually showed was the ingestion of using these tools sort of superpowered the folks, right? And they actually loved and also kind of saw their creativity go up, right, by using it. So it's really interesting. You made this point. I mean, we're really learning real time, about these tools, and that can be pretty exciting.
Yeah, I know, and that's what's kind of what we do is I'm not a marketing guy. I
Yeah.
don't think that way,
Me
right?
neither.
But it kind of falls in my world. So, a lot of times, to your point, I can go and put in what I would term more of my language
Mhm.
and say, this is what the service should do. This is what we're trying to accomplish.
Yes.
Make it marketing.
Yes.
And we'll have it right. So to your point, it does kind of
Yes.
super excel individuals. Another thing that I've seen as well is sales leads a lot now.
Yes.
So I got a phone call the other day, really good voice.
Mhm.
I almost didn't know it was AI.
Yeah.
And it was, they were telemarketing.
Oh yeah.
And I got to the end. It wasn't anything I was going to purchase, but I kind of asked them questions and kind of just to see how the interaction would work. Really good.
Oh yeah.
And at the end, I did say, "Are you AI?" And it said, "Yes, I am."
Oh wow.
And so it did acknowledge that. But to your point, it's for small businesses. Things like that are a great way to expand your resources
Mhm.
and not necessarily have to spend a lot of money to do that.
Yes.
You
Yeah, and that's a similar, like, I think the analogy of the internet and this being sort of a continuation or a next phase, I think is so spot on because there was a lot of talk, when that era happened about, how does Main Street compete? I mean, and I think there was a lot of um, I think in some ways now it's so ubiquitous that we don't really kind of harken back to how much of a game changer those sorts of things were.
Hmm.
But I think this is very similar, right? I think it can help companies scale their business, grow their business. It can certainly, I think, impact, um, you know, driving value and differentiating. I think that's where there's a real creative point to this, right? Of how, and again, it harkens back to where we started, right? Really being thoughtful about use cases and really being creative on that front, I think can pay, some pretty big dividends.
Yeah. And one thing too that we found a little bit
Mhm.
is, we talk about what it's great for, sales leads. We've
Yeah.
seen where they do like employment verifications, things like
Mhm.
that, which are really good, those transactional.
Yes.
Where we've seen a struggle is nuance and empathy.
Mhm. Agreed.
Obviously, we're HR, right?
Mhm.
And so we have a platform called My HR Front Desk,
Yes.
and it's HR resource
Mhm.
platform. And a part of that is an AI application called My HR Valet.
Mhm.
And we built that, and it works really, really well
Mhm.
with tell me about FMLA.
Yes.
Um, when do I need to send out a Cobra notice? All those kinds of things. But one thing we don't use it for is we always say, if you have an employee issue, please call us and let's talk about it. And that's one thing we have seen is where that nuance, where it gets out of that transactional world, it may be lagging a little bit right now.
Agree totally. And I think one of the things that I've read a lot about is that, these models may eventually become highly specialized, and that's one of the things that I've been doing a lot lately is looking at these very specific GPTs, right? A GPT
Mhm.
for just writing a resume, or there's a slew of them now available for academic work, right? So they're trained a little bit differently, and I think that is at least in some way where the world is heading, right? So whether it's HR or legal, you'll eventually have companies, I think, that sort of specialize in, these models that are trained in that space.
Mhm.
Um, that part I think is fascinating, right? I think sort of the open sourced or not conversation in 2025, to your point too, it harkens back to, the days of Java or the days of Sun Microsystems, or, um, how is this going to work? Is it going to be sort of a closed loop, of these models you procure, or are these models going to be built and organizations, take a model and then have the skill set to do something with it, to train it
Yeah.
based on their data, to train it based on maybe their data and the sector they work in, right? I
Mhm.
mean, energy, government, healthcare, I think that's a very undecided kind of place and where the technology is right now. And I think companies are sort of staking out different places. Um, you see Meta with their llama models. Um, folks are taking those, folks are training those to do sort of different things. And then you see these more, kind of models that are out there, a ChatGPT, or I guess, and, Claude's Anthropic, that, they say they do things differently, but basically it's closed, right? Those billions
Right.
of parameters that are built and designed, um, and the data that is trained on. So yeah, very much of a very, very interesting. And I think from a not just inside of a company, but in a company where those technology partnerships happen,
Hmm.
right? I mean, there's all the same concerns about, um, you know, the partners that you use, how are they using these tools? I had a demo a couple of weeks ago of a company that really they've already pivoted to agentic AI, right? So they had a repository for their agents. It almost, I think you'll appreciate this. It almost sounded like the Matrix, like we're talking about agents wandering around. but this software company had a repository of really autonomous agents, which I was good with. The part that got me was they then have partnerships in their ecosystem, right? And in that ecosystem, there were other software packages at other companies that have agents. And you know where this is going, right? The agents were talking to each other across platform. And of course, at that point, I was like, okay, this is really getting kind of interesting here, right? These
Yeah.
agents there's not that much human in the loop, which is something you hear a lot about. These agents are going to be doing these tasks and interacting. And when you're talking about these companies, these are companies that are going to be at scale, that are providing some sort of service, holistically. So, pretty interesting in that as well.
Yeah, and I think, to me, it almost has to be kind of a closed
Uh,
data set.
yeah,
I know we do. We have a proprietary database, but
sure.
otherwise, what we've seen too is, we use ChatGPT. We'll
Mhm.
check it to see what kind of results we get with different
Sure.
questions and those
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
things, just to kind of, just kind of seeing where it goes. And we've seen issues with, obviously ChatGPT is kind of going out to the internet,
Mhm.
and it'll pull back incorrect information. It may be it's pulling back information that's old. It may be it's pulling
Yes.
back different topics.
Mhm.
And so that's where we struggle a lot sometimes with clients that will chat GPT something, it pops an answer,
Mhm.
and we're telling them that's not accurate.
Yes.
But in a lot of people's minds, AI knows all.
Agreed. Yeah. I will tell you, I've read, there's a lot of different work and studies being done on, what we call hallucination rates. I've seen them as high as 27% in some of these models. And, with some of the other stuff that I do, some of the teaching that I do, or some academic stuff I do, I've seen just really uh, crazy hallucinations where it fabricates everything. Authors of an article, the name of the journal. And the
Really?
part that I think is funny, because I know it's not real, but I feel like it's like sliding something in on me. Like it just sort of says, yeah, so I was doing some work this spring um, on a couple of papers, and um, there was this little troublesome section. So I went out to ChatGPT and I said, I've uploaded my manuscript and help me with this. And it returned, 2 or 3 articles. And I was like, amazing. And well, 4. Um, so 3 of the 4 were, by the way, I didn't ask for 4. 3 of the 4 were just unbelievably pitch perfect, right? So I did the right thing. I went to Google Scholar, I found the article, I read it, I did all the thing. The 4th was literally a complete fabrication.
Really?
I thought they would have gotten something wrong. So I put it in Google Scholar and it didn't work and it didn't work. It made up the professors, it made up the journal, and the thing that freaked me out wasn't uh, that it was made up. I actually kind of went a little bit step closer to saying why. I didn't
Mhm.
ask for 4. Why were 3 good and 1 wasn't? But back to your point, I think you really, depending on the work you're doing, you have to validate. You
Yeah.
have to validate, like you're saying, And so now, I still think the tool is extraordinary, um, but I will build validations into my prompts before I ever get there. And I have seen an increase in productivity, but I do think the at least where the tech is now, I think the hallucination side of it is a real thing,
Yeah.
worth paying attention to.
Yeah, and I guess it's just like anything else. It's understanding what it's good at,
Yes,
understanding what it's not, and
totally.
then crafting that, like you said earlier, to fit what you need and to use it in the best way possible for your
Yeah,
case or for your scenario.
yeah,
Um,
agreed. And so, in the tech world now, there's a lot of process automation stuff that's happening. It's happening inside of data centers. And I agree with you totally, right? I think there is a real sweet spot where, again, back to what are your use cases? What are your pain points? Doing sort of that risk and value, kind of work. And then I'm with you. I think there can be a really nice, set of initial use cases on how to move the ball forward. And so, yeah, and we're doing the same thing on our end. The governor signed the executive order for the state, Executive Order 1584 at the beginning of the year. And so we sort of, doubled down. We were kind of doing an inventory, which is what the order calls for. But we're doing a lot of under the cover stuff, a lot of policy stuff, a lot of, ethical kinds of things, sort of really looking at that. And, who knows where the regulatory part of that conversation will need to be. What I do know for sure is that the technology is advancing at a clip that, it'll be hard to keep up with it.
Yeah.
Just because of how fast it's turning over and how fast the market is really driving it.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And one thing I did want to ask is from a regulatory perspective, I know in the big beautiful bill,
Yeah.
they have a 10-year moratorium on state regulation on AI. There's been talk of global regulation. I know there's a moral and an ethical issue with AI as far as how far it goes.
Sure.
Where do you see that part going? I mean, what do you kind of see there?
Well, yeah, the moratorium in the bill, as you mentioned, is hotly debated right now. In some ways it's an exercise in federalism, I mean the states and the federal government. And I think the idea is that, in my mind, the potential moratorium is really focused on not wanting to stymie any sort of innovation, right? It's really about that side of it. And I think that's reasonable, to kind of contemplate what that would look like. I sort of think a couple of things. I mean, I think, if the regulatory component is what would be codified, I think there's a lot that could happen, just from a policy perspective, which is some of the stuff that we're looking at now. But remember too, that there's other, flexible frameworks. Like I was thinking about, NIST, the NIST framework. There's an AI NIST framework, National Institutes of Standards. So there's places you can go. In fact, NIST has I think it's a risk framework, but there's places you can go, even, speaking to your question about this regulatory moratorium, to get insight, to kind of, they talk about guardrails, to kind of put things like that together. My sense of a moratorium was that, it's really focused on not stymieing any sort of innovation. And really, I think, to be candid, being sure that the U.S. leads the way. There's plenty of, if the federal government does that, there are places that we could look, though, right? If we want it to be more holistic, right? And I don't, not necessarily advocating, but of course the European Union has an AI Act. I believe Canada has an AI and Data Act. And so, whether it fits us or not, there would be other places that, if there's a state moratorium, that the federal government could look, right? And maybe it's broad brush, maybe it's sort of, the feds do that and the states can sort of, go from there. We sort of see it, I think, in the near term as much more not necessarily something that needs to be codified, but really just sort of the normal, what we call PSG, policy, standard, and guidelines, of how the government operates, and those kind of things. And I think that would be, I'm not even sure how you would. It's an interesting question, right? Because I'm not even sure, again, the pace of these things that you could even remotely keep up with it.
Right.
There's been a few states that have passed stuff on deep fakes. There's a few in that area, but I don't know. I really think it's moving so quickly. I'm not even sure how you fully get your hands around it.
Yeah, and it seems to me that it's such a powerful tool.
Mhm.
Not only just for everyday life, for business,
Sure.
from a military perspective.
Oh gosh, yeah.
You wanna be first, and it seems to me that I would think every nation is really gonna push the envelope
Mhm.
as fast and as hard as they can.
Yeah.
But I guess most likely the way this works, the regulation is not for the government.
Mhm.
The regulation is for businesses and private entities. That they're going to
Yeah.
push this thing just as fast and as hard as they can because they want to be ahead of their adversaries, right? Russia,
Right.
China, whoever that may be.
And countries are just so different. I went back to school a few years ago, and in one of my classes, the cohort was international, but in one of the classes, it was really interesting to kind of contemplate this question, which was, do companies self-regulate? And I think that was just an interesting question, right? Of,
Mhm.
um, and being in a group with students from around the globe, is a very, very different sort of vibe on that. But to be candid, I was reminded of um, our industrial revolution, 150 years ago or plus, and we had kids in factories on a Saturday, and
Yeah.
so it did take certain things, and so I think the regulatory component over time in sort of the span of history, you sort of take it for granted. No, there are no 12-year-olds making shoes, in a factory. But I think too, there's that balance there, like you said, right? Where I do think the innovation part from an economic perspective is related to, but different than the other concerns ultimately from a regulatory perspective, which is, my privacy, your privacy. Um, are there any biases built into these algorithms, right, that may disenfranchise citizens? Kind of those sort of more ethical elements, which I
Mhm.
think have a relationship to economic development and leading, like you said, countries would do, which I agree with, but also it's sort of a byproduct. You also want to protect people. I mean, you
Right.
want to,
Yeah.
um, your privacy, your data. Um, there's any number of really interesting um, reads about this. One book from memory is called Weapons of Math Destruction, MATH. If folks are interested in that kind of thing, there's another book called The Ethical Algorithm. And if people have interest in it, it really just delves into, and we've talked about this, right? You have these algorithms with these models and it's premised on data. I think, you want to be thoughtful about that, right? You want to be sure that whether it's transparency or privacy, that you do the right thing. I think even with an intent to do the right thing, it's just such a challenge now. Again, harkening back to the speed that these things is progressing. Like daily.
Yeah.
um, there's any number of newsletters that I have vetted and I get that I scan, and even just reading them every day, it's still, can be overwhelming.
Yeah. I can imagine. It's gonna be really interesting.
Mhm.
And I think this is a really interesting topic, and I really
Yeah.
appreciate you jumping on.
Oh, sure.
I've
Happy to
enjoyed
do
it.
it. Yeah, same. Appreciate you.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you, and I want to thank everybody that's listened to the podcast. We appreciate you listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Thank you for listening to the My HR Buzz podcast, presented by My HR Concierge. For more information on this topic and many others, please visit our blog at www.myhrbuzz.com. It's a free resource and has a lot of great information on HR and employee screening related topics. If you like the podcast, please do 3 things for us. 1, leave a review. 2, subscribe to the podcast. And 3, tell a friend. Our podcasts are available on iTunes, Spotify, and many other places where you get your favorite podcasts. If you'd like to provide ideas or feedback on future shows, send us an email at podcast@myhrbuzz.com, or you can reach us at 855-538-6947, extension 108. This is Chris Cooley with My HR Concierge. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to sharing more topics with you in the future.